Pirate Kings, Pirate Queens, non-binary monarchs of the sea, One Piece, Set 7, 500 years into the future is out. It's time to get into this data. All week, I've been posting videos on the top decks from the Asian version of the post-ban OP07 format, and this video has all of those rolled into one, as well as some statistics on the format as a whole. If you came from one of those earlier videos, good to see you. We made it. Here we are. And if this is your first time on the channel, here's a bit about my process for these videos. I have gone through OnePieceTopDecks.com, SecondStorage.com, and Firefist.gg to log every single deck list that either won or topped a tournament in the Asian version of the Set 7 format, put them all into a giant spreadsheet, and assigned each list a point value based on the scale of competition of that tournament, the deck's placing in the tournament, and how far into the format that tournament took place. With that, I've been able to rank each leader as well as come up with a standard topping deck list for that leader, along with some very useful metrics on cost curve, amount of counter, number of 2K counters, non-counter characters, blockers, events, cards with a certain type even, as well as some tech choices and general popularity of cards that got used with each leader. I've also been reading a fair amount of Japanese articles from Note.com and doing some of my own testing to get further insight into these decks and why players made the choices they did, all for the purpose of getting us as ready as we can be for this set once it comes out over here. So thank you again for coming along, welcome to Sakura Kingdom, and let's finish off the countdown to OP07. OP07 was released on February 24th, 2023 in Japan and featured 6 new mono-colored leaders: Monkey D. Dragon, Jewelry Bonney, Boa Hancock, Foxy, Rob Lucci, and Vegapunk. In my opinion, the set did a really good job of mixing support for older archetypes, building off of what was given to us in EB01, and establishing new archetypes. Red had some nice Revolutionary Army and film cards, green focused on supernovas, blue gave us more 7 Warlord support and some Kuja pirates, purple gave us the Foxy crew, black gave us more CP0, and yellow introduced the Egghead archetype. And quick aside, it's still kind of crazy to me that Egghead was just starting in the manga when this card game came out. It feels like we just got the starter deck reveals. In the time this game has gone on, though, we have had some oppressive decks, the most recent of which was Sakazuki, and Bandai decided to address that. At the beginning of March, Bandai announced that 3 cards will be banned: the Set 5 Sakazuki leader, Great Eruption, and Reject, all of which were quite welcome, even to a degenerate Reject lover like myself. Set 7 had been out for a week, some trends had already begun to establish themselves, and Japan was sort of in a bit of limbo at this point. Some people still want to play Sakazuki because it was their last chance to use him. Some people decided they wanted to get a bit of a head start on the post-ban format. As such, all of these stats in the slides I go through for these decks will only be considering the post-ban lists from April 1st on in Japan. But since I have the data, I do want to take a quick second to go over the pre-ban format, and as a reminder, here are my tier definitions that I've established throughout these videos. So if we just take the raw data from that pre-ban period, here is a tier list of how each deck stacked up. Honestly, not bad. I would not complain about this. Even if I didn't really enjoy playing Enel. Nothing above 23% for our time-adjusted cumulative achievement score. Sakazuki wasn't even the top leader at this point. Now, like I mentioned before, there probably was a significant portion of people who decided they would just switch off of Sakazuki, so I can't say for sure whether or not he was still a problem in pre-ban Set 7. To me, it's just really cool that the ban list as a deterrent created one of the most balanced formats this game has had. There was a period of time, about a week or so before the ban list hit, when Sakazuki just stopped doing anything. There were no reported tops among the websites that I have sourced this data from. If I move that ending boundary of this time period to Sakazuki's last reported finish, here's how that changes. Sakazuki ends up in Tier 1 between Enel and Lost, still not number 1, Again, slightly suspect due to other conditions informing this data, but still cool. Moria and Yamato end up in Tier 3 to equalize things. Rogue and Haunt get a little shuffled around, But that's just a beautiful distribution, if I do say so myself. In fact, if we get a teeny bit granular and look at these leaders' achievement shares over time, yeah, sure, Enel was getting a little too big for his britches at the start there. But once we get into mid-March, those were a really, really cool couple weeks. That's honestly the kind of format that I dream of. Lots of decks seeing wins, the top spot shifting so much as the days go on. Granted, people were still figuring OP07 itself out and trying to get a head start on the post-ban format. But this is what I dream of. Hopefully we can see one of these down the line, please. But around these parts, we're already playing post-ban, so let's get into that data. In the tier, we have Blue Doflamingo. I really want someone to chef with him. I really want someone to do well with him. Those 7 Warlords cards are too cool to not do something neat. Katakuri, bit of a fall from grace there. Zoro Sanji, Blue Yellow Ace. Ivankov, Rebecca, Foxy. Odin, Zephyr, Red Luffy, Green Purple Dofi, Queen, Red Green Law, and Red Black Sabo. Each of those only had 1 or 2 reported finishes, so if you are looking to play one of those leaders, take a look at one of the websites that I mentioned in the intro. The decks in Rogue did have a few more finishes though, so I have made some slides for those. In order of least to greatest achievement, we have Purple Luffy, Reiju, Blue Hancock, Red Purple Luffy, Blue Nami, and Yamato. Hopefully those slides give my Rogue friendos some nice starting points. I know that I am a big fan of Hancock. I'll probably be chefing with her a little bit. But for Tier 3 and beyond, I've got a little more to say, so I'm going to send things over to Sakura Kingdom from just under a week ago. Starting things off at number 7, we have a deck that I was very, very fond of back in OP06 that has a new direction thanks to some cool cards from OP07, EB01, and an event from Set 1 that I had no idea would ever see play. Perona. Our general strategy is pretty similar to what it was in OP06. Start the game off with Searchers to divert our opponent's attacks away from our life, and then use the leader ability to either reduce or rest our opponent's characters, control the board in the mid game, then in the late game we go tall, we get a big board, keep scaling down our opponent's resources, and just grind them out until they can't play anymore, and we finish them off. And hoo-wee, Perona's got a good grind game going. She's, she went to Tokyo U, she took some business classes, she's managing the Hot Topic now, she is great with money, she's made some good friends, business partnerships. She is seeing cards. She's getting that paper. But she does still run Suru. Amazing card for black. Absolute staple. 2k counter. On play reduce a character's cost by 2. Perona lists in set 6 weren't really running Great Eruption that much anyway. But she is black's most efficient cost reducer post-ban. We're also running 8 searchers between our 4 copies of Kozuki Momonosuke and Otama. Together, these two give us so much access to our Land of Wano package. We can get our Ryuma, our other Wano cards, which we'll be getting into, and even though they both have 0 power, they still have use on the board beyond that search. And that's because, in my opinion, the coolest thing about this build is that a competitive deck is finally playing You Can Be My Samurai. There were some lawless that played it now and then in OP01, but this is the norm for Perona instead of something wacky like it was for Law. Between all of our searchers, our small cost reducers, we have lots of utility cards that never really attack. So we don't have to worry about this card's usual downside of taking away our offense, and we might divert some of those smaller swings at our life away if they don't want us having the chance to either search with Momonosuke or Pot of Greed again. A lot of times in set 6 when Perona would go first, she'd have an extra dome as she played out an even curve, and in the middle turns, this extra dome gets some more use, especially since we're not even that pressed to attach to our lead anyway when we swing at a rested character, because the opponent's going to expect us to Ryuma them anyway. So You Can Be My Samurai not only gets us more use out of our small characters, but also lets us be more efficient with our Don as well. One-Legged Soldier gives a character -3 to their cost, just like Helmeppo does, but One-Legged Soldier is also a 2k, and his effect is Activate Main. So we can rest him with You Can Be My Samurai, and then still get that reduction off afterward. Inupe was a cool fringe pick in set 6, and he saw way more play in OP07. He's going to help us dig for our unsearchable cards, our Moria, our Sabo, Ice Age in particular, as well as fuel the trash up for those Moria plays. And he's a great target for You Can Be My Samurai, or he can swing into a searcher that we rest with our leader ability. Izo is a 2k counter and a Wano type, and he helps especially when Law has multiple active characters that we need to swing into or KO, and our leader ability isn't quite enough to give us the tempo we need. And then the 4-cost Borsalino's back in action now that Sakazuki isn't going to bottom deck him anymore. Granted, Law can still tuck him, but that's only one of our big matchups instead of two, like it was in EVO 1. And since Perona likes keeping a healthy life total to give her stability as she heads into the middle and late game, it's always a great feeling when we can block a 7k with Borsalino and then slap a 2k on to keep him alive. Ryuma is still our mid-game superstar to KO the rested characters on our opponent's board, and honestly, we're fine to rest him with You Can Be My Samurai since the on-KO effect will dissuade our opponent from attacking into him, and even if they do, we can still bring him back with Moria. And then we have another really cool new Wano card, Kozuki Hiyori. Activate main, you can place her into the trash, then place a 5 or less Land of Wano type character, other than Hiyori, of course, from the hand onto the field, and then you draw one. So you can just rest her with Samurai, use her effect, send her to the trash, play Ryuma or Yama-san, 5-cost 7k vanilla, love to see it, and then you get to draw one. So you get to use You Can Be My Samurai, but then you have an offensive threat your opponent can't attack into, and you get an extra card out of it. She is very worth the 2 slots. Our 5-cost Sabo is a black staple. He has been for a little while now. Love filtering out for those unsearchables, love making it so our characters can't be KO'd by opponent's effects. Not much else to say about him aside from the fact that he's still good and he fits in this deck perfectly. Heading into the top end, let's all wish a happy belated Father's Day to Gecko Moria. On 8-Dome, we can potentially revive Hiyori and Soldier, use Soldier's effect to reduce a 7-cost down to 4, rest it with the leader ability, and then use that Hiyori to bring the Ryuma out and KO it. But there's also something to be said about waiting to use him till turn 5 and combining him either with Ice Age to get more reach, or You Can Be My Samurai to keep the card advantage up. And resting him isn't even a huge issue since our opponent has to invest more resources to swing into a 9k body. And our other 8-drop is the new Secret Rare Sabo from Set 7. On play, he can KO a 5-cost and a 3-cost by discarding 1 card from our hand. He is our go-to option versus Law because we need to keep their board in control, and we've got plenty of draw here to hopefully offset the cost of discarding one. And then if we add our leader ability, Suru, Soldier, Ice Age, some combination of those into the picture, we can really expand that range he has and get some nice tempo plays to keep the board advantage up. And speaking of Ice Age, it wasn't quite as popular in those Set 6 builds, but it definitely has a place here. I already mentioned using it to expand Sabo's range, but even with Ryuma, we can get some big targets. If we think as tall as possible, we've got a 2-card combo to out Moria, 8-cost Katakuri, Yamato. We can even hit the 10-cost ace that Enel is running if we use the -1 from leader, since he'll very often swing the turn he comes out. Then heading into our card counts, we see that Suru, Moria, Ryuma were played in every single deck. Sabo and the Wano package were very widespread, followed by Borsalino, Soldier, Inupe, Yama-san, Ice Age. Sabo was in 50% of decks, and then some played Stussy as well. I like her a lot. I think that the list the algorithm was giving me before the last couple entries actually had a 2-1 split of Sabo and Stussy. Only needing 1 card to KO anything can really come in clutch, and with this Samurai package, there's going to be plenty of characters that you're okay sending to the trash. And then beyond those, we've got a few more tech options. Zoro and Dofi both saw some play in the initial phase of post-ban OP07. I like the idea of Doflamingo, but something feels weird about using all 10 Don in 1 turn. I feel like I always want to have one free either for Samurai or for an Otama search. And I personally would rather KO, but Dofi is still a valid option. Same for Zoro. He's a great card, helps us out in a lot of matchups. Something just doesn't feel... It just doesn't feel like he gels with the rest of the deck. I don't know. It just doesn't feel right to me, but if you want to try him, go for it. Rocinante is a pretty cool pick. He got combined with Kid in a couple lists. If you want to go for that stall strategy instead of going for more 2-character KOs with Sabo, also valid. I also just like him to stop some of our arrested characters from getting KO'd, especially after we samurai them. Wasn't expecting to see Belmare here, if I'm being honest with you. She actually found her way into a couple of lists right before the end of the format. I didn't really see anyone talking about her in the articles I read. I assume she just expands Ryuma's range a little bit without giving up an Ice Age or a 2K. Seems cool. Maybe I'll try it out. Tenko's Kuzan was in one early post-ban list. Does vibe with the general strategy, gets more things in range of the leader ability and Ryuma, but he's a big investment. That's 4 spots that could be our consistency engine. I don't know if I'm feeling it, honestly. Then Kuzan and Sakazuki were both in one list from, I want to say, a week and a half into the format. Very experimental. People were still very much figuring out what was good in the format. No Wano package, no nothing. Another direction. Might try it, but I can't say I'm super interested in it. I think there are enough black decks I can use the Admirals just fine. In fact, the Tashigi, the Sengoku, the Branu, the Drake, those were all in that same list. Very, very Navy focused. Drake was used a lot in set 6 as extra Ryuma. Not sure he's quite as necessary with the consistency boost the Wano package gives us. Helmeppo is also cool to bring out off Moria, but I'd rather have Soldier in this deck. I want the 2K. I do like the idea of Bartolomeo from set 7. That is pretty nifty. We're, of course, resting things all the time with our leader ability. And if there's one thing this deck loves, it's consistency. I just wonder if it might be a little win more with all the drawing we're already doing. But it's worth testing. I'll probably try him out if I keep playing Perona. And then whoever wins this war becomes Justice. Good card. I'll take a 0-cost 3K event if we need it. I've felt decent about the amount of counter in this deck so far, but it's always worth considering. And it's also going to be too much for me to fit on a slide, but as I've considered these videos, I'm realizing that the percentage played for each card and each count of that card doesn't fully give the picture of how each card ranks in these decks. That's a whole other algorithm. I can go over it some other time if people would like me to. Otherwise, here are the 10 cards that can be cut most easily without creating too much deviation, I guess would be the term. And then 10 cards that could be added with the least deviation. You'll see repeats out of order. That's just to preserve the precedence that each one has in the algorithm. Potential adds are the 2 Zoro, a 2nd Yamasan, 3rd Soldier, the 1 Belmare, which I need to research this more. I wish I had an answer for you here. This completely blindsided me. 4th copy of Soldier, 3rd Hiyori, 1 Stussy, and then 1 or 2, whoever wins this war becomes the victor. Justice, whatever it is. These feel like some good options to me. And then our cuts are the 2 Anupe, the 3rd and 4th Ice Age. That one, I don't know about. I was testing the 2 Ice Age at first, and I at least wanted a 3rd. I think 3 Ice Age at least, in my opinion. The 3rd 8-cost Sabo, the single Yamasan we have, the 2 Soldier, and 1 of the 4 Borsalinos. So Soldier could really go either way. Same with Yamasan, depends on what you're feeling. I like them both myself. But that's Perona. This deck is still fun, still really cool. The Wano package is a breath of fresh air. Actually, these Japanese articles were calling it Ecology Perona, which I find very fun. That's a great name. She was really picking up steam in this middle part of the post-ban meta as an anti-meta pick. She was seeing her most success in that second third of the post-ban meta. Before and after, she was pretty rogue. She's not busting the ceiling of the game's power level, but she's very fun, and a good pilot can do very well with her. If you're big into sequencing, generating card advantage, and combo, then I think this is a really fun deck. I highly recommend it. And I hope to see her get some wins in set 7 on our side. I think she could do well. Our number 6 deck is a player favorite from set 6, Gecko Moria. I've always loved Graveyard Shenanigans. I love how well-designed, how mid-rangey, how versatile this leader is. But with Black Yellow Luffy rising in popularity and KO resistance having more value post-ban, he does have a bit more of an uphill battle than he did before. He doesn't really have a ton of focused support in this new set, and the loss of Great Eruption does hurt a bit, but some new inclusions can help him stay relevant. Of course, we're playing for Suru, Black Staple. Without Great Eruption, she is our cheapest cost reducer, so she comes in handy. Full playset of Sindri to fill our trash, and as a 2K counter, we can retrieve with Hogback if we need to. Access to and recursion of our resources is even more important post-ban than it was in set 6. A playset of Brand New is going to be pretty necessary. He still picks up some of our best cards, especially since these new inclusions we have to adapt to the OP07 meta are Navy type, and even if you whiff on him, he still fills your trash either way. Since we're going to be playing Sindri pretty often, and Suru a little more than we did before, Toshigi comes in handy as a 13th 2k counter, even if we don't end up finding much use for her otherwise. Hina came in handy pretty often during OP06, especially at 6 or 7 Don to combine with Absalom off the leader ability, but she's even more necessary for reduction post-ban. The thing to keep in mind, though, is that Moria's never been strictly a control deck, and we're going to lean even further into that aggro direction of slamming a barrage of 5Ks when we want to deplete our opponent's hand, so her stat line is just as important as that cost reduction. And then we've got Rebecca, one of the best cards ever printed in black. She was pretty here or there in set 6, but in set 7 she was played almost all the time. Never at 4 though. The list is just a little tight with our new additions, and she's also removed very easily by Law's Leader effect, any 2 cost reduction versus black, and by that new Egghead Luffy in yellow decks. But she's still worth using because she can recur our resources, especially our 2k counters, either when you play her at 7 with that Hina combo, or off of Moria, but she's not obligatory to include. There is room to cut her if there's something you really need to find space for. Since reviving Thriller Bark characters is this deck's whole shtick, Absalom, all those other Thriller Bark 4 costs are still at a full 4 of. Even though we're not KOing left and right, he's still very important for keeping our tempo up. But against blue decks, and especially against Law, you want to be careful about timing him right. Tuck your only copy, that can be pretty painful. Borsellino's relevant again, and he is still a great blocker who can tax our opponent's attacks, and helps us out in pretty much any matchup except for Law. And once again, with the control aspect slightly hampered, the resource difference that Moria creates is more important than ever, so Hawkback can either facilitate Moria plays when you need a copy, or loop your Sindri or your Perona to stay alive, especially versus Law with all of their swings. Kuzan's always going to warrant a response from our opponent, whether we play him from hand or off of our 8-cost Moria. Since he replaces himself, that's absolutely fine. Don't even assume you'll get to use his -4 effect. Just take the free card and run with it. 2 copies will be plenty since we want to use our Thriller Bar characters as much as possible as we progress through the mid-game, and because he doesn't have counter. Perona is the key to adapting against what's most likely our worst matchup, Black-Yellow Luffy. As often as possible, we want to be ripping cards out of their hand. That way we can shorten that time frame when they can easily pump their leader up to 9k and just counter out of any swing we throw at them. And even though the opponent does get to choose which card they discard, our aim is just to reduce the number of cards in their hand. Either way, it cuts down their resources and gets us closer to being able to close that game out. And then the 5-cost Sabo lets us circumvent Lucci's control strategy and stay alive versus Luffy as he keeps hitting us for 11k in the late game. Plus, we can grab him from our trash off of Rebecca, get blockers out, keep that wall up, keep our KO immunity on, and the draw 2 trash 2 is perfectly in line with our game plan, so what's not to like? Everything so far has been pretty familiar. I didn't want to spend too much time on that, but now I get into a couple new cards. That Sakazuki from set 2 is finally seeing play. There are a lot of 5-cost characters that we just don't want to deal with in this format. Particularly the Yellow Luffy and the 5-drop Purple Kid, but also Cavendish, even Gadatsu, so he takes care of those pretty cleanly. Plus, if we combine him with Hina, we can KO a 9-drop. If we use either Hina or Perona and Suru, we can get a 10-drop. Again, control is not the main strategy here, it's not our only tool, but it is a significant one, even without Eruption. The 7k stat line is also really useful because, 1, it's the magic number to get 2 cards out of our opponent's hand, but against Law, they have to use 2 reducers if they want to tuck him. And we're only spending 6 to play him, so this dude might be a pencil pusher now, but he's good at his job, he's not costing us a lot, I'ma roll with it. And 8-cost Moria is still the MVP of black decks. What else can I say about the guy? We can go Kuzan brand new to get more resources. We can set up blockers. We can potentially get that last KO we need to stay alive. And 9k is exactly what we need to whittle Luffy's hand down. And I wrote this last part before we got the set 9 Teach Leader reveal, But until this card is either restricted, we get rotation, or if Teach just completely shuts him down, he's going to keep this deck alive in some capacity. And our final card is the true MVP against Luffy, and against Yellow in general, Isho. Ripping 2 cards from hand at random can make a world of difference in outlasting Luffy in particular, but any deck that hoards cards. And his blanket -3 to cost makes Absalom much more effective. With this effect and Hina, Absalom can drop a 9 cost. He doesn't help us quite as much against Law since they already have a lower hand size and their characters don't require as much reach to KO. So I very much recommend tailoring his counts as well as Sakazuki's to match whatever meta you're going to be playing in. Heading into our card counts, we will see that every single list considered was playing a full set of Suru, Branu, Hogback, Perona, Absalom, and the 8-cost Moria. Sabo and Isho were also present in every list, most playing a full set of Sabo, and 2 to 3 Isho depending. Hina and Borsalino were very popular. I'm surprised to see Sindri at 85 and that many lists playing her at 3 or 2. I was expecting full 4 counts. Interestingly, there were some players who were working with a full 4 copies of Tashigi. It looks like those lists were still trying to salvage the control direction as much as they could. There might be some value there. One of them did have 15 2Ks in total, so keep that in mind. Kuzan and Becky in 3/4 of the lists, pretty solid at 2 or 3 of. And Helmeppo was in a majority of lists, but not successful enough to make it into this one. He was mostly played in the earlier part of the post-ban format. People were still figuring out what would make the deck still work, and his popularity very much dropped after the first couple weeks. And one card that has been noticeably absent from our data list is Lucci. He was in 38% of these lists, more than a third, so there can be an argument to be made for him, but clearly most of these players did not need him to succeed with Moria. And I see this as indicative of the direction that Moria has to go in to succeed without Eruption. Double KOs will not come as easily as they used to. I suppose against Law you could go Helmeppo on 1/4 cost, Suru on another. Ice Age can also help you in that regard. I'd say just be careful with the amount of counter if you're going to play Lucci. Cerberus could also be a pretty nice, cheap way to get around Black Yellow Luffy's 11k swings. Maybe against something like the 9-cost Zoro and Bonney, but there's always the risk of them resting us with an Apu. And there's that Sakazuki. Only in 31% of these decks, but those decks were 2 of the most recent wins that Moria had, and one of them actually won the Indonesia Championship. Somebody ran set 2 Sengoku at the very end of the format. I guess maybe you put 2 on him, swing into one of Law's rested characters, -2 to something else, and then you go Moria, Absalom, Branu. This is interesting. It was only 1 copy. I guess I'm just surprised it's not Tashigi. Interesting. And then Brook was also in one of those more control-oriented builds. I can see him helping Lucci out quite a bit. And then early on in the format, someone used T-Bone as their extra 2k of choice. I'll never criticize that. He's a great guy. Love to see him. The 10 easiest cuts, according to the data, are our 4th Hina, both Sakazuki's, the 3rd Isho, our 4th Sindri, very interesting to me, the 2 Kuzan, 2nd Becky, the 4th Borsalino, and then actually the 1st Rebecca as well. Potential additions, we could bump Sokka up to 3, we could add a 2nd Tashigi, add both Cerberus, add a Helmeppo, 3rd Kuzan, a 4th Isho, actually, a 4th Kuzan, or an Ice Age. Moria is in a very interesting spot right now. I think he's going to require a lot of testing, a lot of matchup knowledge, a lot of trial and error with the deck building, but it's been shown that he can still do well. And I'm not at liberty to share the specific matchup rates that I've gotten from OP Bounty, one of the amazing ranked sim options we have. Highly recommend it. Actually, quick plug, their Patreon's only $5 a month, and you get all the data. It's everything I've ever wanted. But from their matchup data, it's a small piece of the pie overall, still over 1,000 games. I think it's a small group of very, very dedicated Moria players, but just matchup rate to matchup rate, his spread looks very good for those players. So do I think he is necessarily going to be the dark horse best deck in format of set 7 post-ban once that comes around to us this week? Not necessarily. But I do think that with the time, with the knowledge, you can still do very well with this deck. And now we're getting into our first new leader of the countdown. This one really caught my eye when I first read the effect. It is Jewelry Bonney. Once per turn, when our opponent attacks, we can rest one Don and then rest either one of their characters or their leader. To me, that just feels like an incredibly powerful ability, either cutting down the number of our opponent's attacks or stunning one of our opponent's big characters is great for saving resources and giving our opponent some tougher choices in how they sequence their turn. Plus, some other new cards that we use to stay extra Don efficient make her a very, very fun leader to play. The vast majority of these topping lists ran a Supernova package, and Bonney from Starter Deck 2 is our go-to consistency piece. If we play her and use her effect on 2 Don, we are searching for a Supernova-type character, and then diverting our opponent's initial attack on our life. At the same time, playing her in the mid-game gives us a bit more precision with our searches, and gives us the chance to soak up some attacks that we might not be able to counter out of as easily, might be a little more valuable to our opponent. The new Scratchman Apu from EB01 mainly works here as a 2K, but occasionally you'll run into some situations where a chump blocker, think something like Cerberus Rosinante, the yellow Shirahoshi, is the only thing stopping you from getting lethal, so from time to time there will be a very efficient way to sneak that last blow in. Don Quixote Rocinante complements our top end beautifully since we run the 8-drop Kid, and he gives insurance against KO effects to our rested characters in general. And in a deck that loves to win through sheer board advantage, he is an automatic 4-of. Starter deck Apu could potentially rest one of our opponent's Don if we attach Don to him and then attack with him. That could be useful in the mirror specifically, but he's not obligatory. His main use is just being a searchable 2K. And then Izo rounds out our 2K counters, and he gets to rest a 4 cost, a very relevant number in this. Like Apu, this can let us get around some blockers, or in certain instances when we already have enough defense on board or in hand, get more swings in on Law's board while we try to starve his life. The set 7 Bartolomeo started seeing play after the ban, and he's got some nice stats. 4K is just annoying enough to make Law hate having to use a reducer to tuck him, and being a 3 cost means that Kid plays him for free. His effect lets us draw one and trash one to get closer to our unsearchables if we rest an opponent's character. Just keep in mind that it's only on our own turn, so the leader effect and Hawkins don't trigger this. Hody Jones's on-play ability and 8-cost Kid's self-rest ability will trigger this if he's already on the field. Otherwise, the other options are Apu and Izo, so if you really need to cycle one, just make sure that you can take that even or negative trade encounter before you try and filter. Now we can get into the real stars of this deck, and I'm not even talking about the high-cost characters. When you see a Rouge and he sticks on the field, you're playing a different game. Leader ability, like I said, is incredibly powerful, but leaving one Don up each turn stops us from developing our curve as optimally as we'd like. So having a Rouge there to set one Don active at the end of our turn kicks the deck wide open, to the point that he's usually my mulligan target, even above our big finishers like Kid, Hody, and Zoro. And then the other just nasty card that the Supernovas got in EB01 was Cavendish. He can unrest 2 Don either when he comes into play or when he attacks, so this frees up our curve in a similar manner as a Rouge. But he also, in a sort of roundabout way, puts us a turn ahead on our curve as we approach 10. And then once we're at 10, we have access to really 12 Don each turn, as long as we're splitting it between 2 things at least. Couple examples of how you could use this. On turn 4 going second, you can play a Rouge and Hawkins. Turn 4 going first, you can play the Cavendish and then still play in a Rouge after that. Turn 5 going first, we already have access to the standard Kid or Zoro plays, but we could also play Hody and a Rouge, Cavendish and Hawkins, and then at 10 Don, you can play 2 Hawkins in the same turn if you really want to. But going back to the turn that you play him, if you already have a Rouge out, you can use those 2 Don for a Bonney search, and then we get into that pattern I mentioned before, where we're soaking up those more valuable attacks and having more precision with that search. Suffice to say, this guy is just an absolute monster when it comes to building our board, filling out our curve, and even for finishing off the game. And our final new card might be the most unbelievable, Basil Hawkins. First off, he's 7k, so he taxes your opponent harder than almost any mid-cost blocker that's seen play in recent times, and he's relatively easy to defend whether he blocks or on the turn after he attacks. And if that just native durability wasn't enough, Bandai kept his Devil Fruit in the design, and If you know me, you know I love when they do this sort of thing, even if he's most irritating thing ever if I have to play against him. If our opponent tries to remove him from the field, not just KO him, but just remove him in general with an effect, we say no and then rest one of their characters instead. That's dark magic, that's voodoo on a whole new level. The workaround would be to either swing over him or only try to remove him when we have no characters or if all of our characters are rested. But with Sakazuki gone, the only decks that use non-character removal are Law, Enel, Hancock, maybe Lucci if they were in Finger Gun. But I'll tell you right now, that's not a very popular card. This might not be the matchup they're teching for. And then when it comes to Law, at least, leaving all their characters rested and using 2 reducers can be kind of a risky move. So chances are they're just going to ignore him 90% of the time. He is an amazing defensive card. Once again, auto 4 of. You gotta have him here. Our top end starts with Hody Jones. If you've played against a green deck in the past 3 months, you know how devastating he can be when it comes to closing out a game. He has Rush, he can rest blockers or Doan, but I think he's just as valuable in this deck to help control the board, especially against Law, and then resting a Doan in the mirror can come in clutch, which makes your use of Cavendish and Rouge crucial in that mirror. An 8-cost kid's still relevant. The card was good out the gate, and he's determined to stay that way. Since our leader ability is going to take away one of our opponent's attackers, they'll inevitably go taller when they would have gone wide instead, so having an 8k wall that just spits out a 3-cost blocker when he comes out does wonders for us. In order to get him off the board, Enel needs to either use 8-cost Katakuri or Kingdom Come. Lucci needs just a fair amount of resources to out an 8-cost. Law has to use 2 reducers if he wants to tuck Kid. Only thing to watch out for in the Law matchup is that if you don't have blockers that are more than 5k, his plan might be to use 1 reducer on the Kid, then just swing 5 at him over and over, so be very careful resource-wise against him, plan for that pattern before you play him down, but if he sticks, and then especially if you get 2 down, this guy's putting in work. Some things just don't change. And our final character is 9-cost Zoro. The minute he hits the board, 90% of the time your opponent just has to have an out to him or it's game over. That, or they spit out more blockers than we can rest, or somehow have enough counter to get through after that. But we all know, 16k 3 times, that's pretty devastating. In the mirror, how well you use him and the chance to either go all in with multiple attacks or leave him active is going to be vital. And he is our best bet to put the pressure we need to on Enel and Black Yellow Luffy. If you starve Law well enough that he sticks, there is a chance he could close that game on his own, but my testing on Bonney's side of the matchup is pretty limited, and honestly, it really just worked because I saw 2 copies in one very, very cool game. Either way, he is indispensable. You need to run him at least 2. Most decks had him at 4. And to round things out, we have 2 copies of Whoever Wins This War Becomes Justice in order to get some more use out of any extra non-counter characters we see. But the trigger comes in very handy when we do see it, especially against, you guessed it, Law. And now let's switch it over to our card count stats. One disclaimer I want to make is that for the algorithm list and for these slides, I did not consider any list running 10-cost Doflamingo. He's going to change the list considerably, and there were also enough lists running Dofi that topped where I can make a separate deck list for him that we can take a look at later. Our main package, Bonney, Rosinante, Cavendish, Hawkins, those ones are played at 4 in every deck, but every deck's going to run at least some number of our Hody, Zoro, Rouge, Bartolomeo, Kid. Once we get to the Izo and Apu, they're very common. A couple lists decide to stray from the 2k section of the deck. You'll see those on the next slide. EB01 Apu was still in more than 3/4 of these lists. Whoever wins, that's where you start to tip a little lower, but still in a lot of lists and still gives us a lot of utility. But if we look at these other lists, there is a sizable difference in their prevalence, and as you can see, it's because there were also some alternative builds of Bonney. Before I get too ahead of myself, though, Dellinger was actually running a couple of relatively straightforward Supernova lists. Those ones cut out the Whoever Wins, shaved Rouge down to 3. He's another way to get an active Doan at the end of our turn that can come out through 8-cost Kid, so if our opponent gets rid of our Rouge or we just don't get the chance to see him, we can still get a Don't active and play Kid if we hit 9 Don't going first. Couple lists in the first week added Killer to go with Kid. You know, they're a great combo. Diaz Drake was in that Dellinger list as well. A lot of people played him in the list, I think often in a full 4 of before the ban. And I do like the idea of using him here to get rid of some of Law's rested characters. But a lot of those lists were also running the 8 cost Rosinante to give our 5 cost immunity. So part of that package has fallen by the wayside. There was one list that had a slight Doflamingo Pirates package, didn't play the 10 cost, didn't go full on in that direction, but still used Baby 5 from Set 5 to search out the 2k counters from the Don Quixote Pirates, our Rosinante, whoever wins. Valid direction to go in, I think. Similar thing with Kami and the new Fishman Pirates. Zio's a 2k, Jinbei can rest a 1 cost and still swing for 5. Interesting. Hody and Hyozo also let you rest a, I believe, 4 cost character and then take a life, so as long as you can defend yourself decently, that build can get some mileage out of there. Then Hachi's another great 2k that can come out of trigger. And then the 6 cost AK Apu is just another strong attacker. Plenty of other things that we'd be happy spending 6 on, like Hawkins. And that 5 cost Bonney is another remnant of the pre-ban Bonney lists. Sort of like a mini Doflamingo. On play, you can freeze an opponent's rested character or one of their Don. So if you say player on 7, stop your opponent from using their Moria on 8. In that sense, she could be a pretty cool tech card, but I think at this point the list is just kind of tight, and it's already really, really consistent. I love this build that we've got up here in the first slide. As much as I love this list, though, I will not pretend it's beyond changes. The first 10 picks for cuts would be our 2 copies of Whoever Wins, our 4th Barto, our 4th Kid, our 4th Erouge, our 4th and 3rd Stardekapu, as well as that first copy of Whoever Wins, along with our 4th and 3rd copies of the EBO1 Apu. As far as what we'd add, more pizza. Great Searcher, gets us more of our Supernova characters, keeps us consistent. We could run a 3rd copy of Whoever Wins if you feel like you need more counter power. Then we have up to 3 Dellinger as an option. I did start liking him more and more after I realized that we can play him off Kid. That didn't occur to me until I was recording this. And then 1 or 2 of Diaz Drake. Personally, I'm biased. This was my favorite card back in set 1. I did just go over why I don't think I need to run him, but I might be giving mixed messages here. I'm kind of getting mixed messages from him here. Like, what's his deal? You know, is he a pirate? Is he a cop? I can't figure him out, but I'm intrigued, you know? Sidebar that's completely unrelated to the card game. I know sometimes we get those semi-canon, not written by Oda, but supervised Oda novels. There was the Ace one, there's the Law one. We're getting a Zoro one pretty soon. Look into that. I love just a really cool espionage Black Ops Drake novel. I don't know, just putting that out there. I don't know, if you've got a character that you want to see more lore for, if there's a character you're always hyped to see cards brand for, I'd love to hear about that. Let me know. And before we finish up, here is what the algorithm gave us for a Doflamingo specific list. And before we finish up, here is what the algorithm gave me for a Doflamingo specific list. Looking at it now, the main changes are the 2Ks. We did take out Barto. We did shave down Kid and Zoro. There's another Whoever Wins in there. I'll be completely honest, I have not played any games with this build. I haven't really done a ton of research on it. The only real commentary I was able to find in my article reading was that basically the player who reported on it felt iffy not having a Don open automatically if he didn't have a Rouge and if he plays Dofi. I believe he said it was a little less proactive and more stally. At first glance, seems valid. 10 cost Doflamingo was incredibly popular pre-ban, and lists featuring him did still get a couple wins. In fact, Bonney's last 2 tops were Doflamingo Pirates builds, so it could still have some relevance. And again, I can't speak from practical experience, but if you enjoy this leader, if you've been a fan of 10-drop Doflamingo in the past, definitely worth a try. Now for number 4, this deck just will not die. The format will not close the game. Against him, one of my faves, it's Enel. So, funny story, well, might be funny to some people. It's funny to me now. I gained a new appreciation for this deck during EBO1 when almost all of my cards got stolen, and this was one of the only decks that I had left. And I'd written him off in the format since the data actually didn't place him that highly for EBO1. Small sample size. That's neither here nor there. But that circumstance made me remember why I liked Enel so much. I love me a nice, long game of One Piece. I love that adrenaline rush when my opponent's just close enough to closing out against me, but then boom! Trigger! Or I make sure that my opponent doesn't have enough swings on me, if I'm able to. And Enel's got some nice control options, not full on like, say, Sakazuki was, or your standard black deck, but enough to get some real nice tempo going, limit our opponent's options, and big bodies to contest the board. And there are some really good yellow cards in OP07 that he can take advantage of. Before the ban in OP07, he was actually ahead of Sakazuki, ironically enough. And speaking of the ban, losing Reject does hurt the deck's control capabilities and its surprise lethal aspects to a degree, but we can make up for it just fine. We're still looking to take over the board just enough to make our opponent unable to lethal us, and play big bodies that heal us, and set up our own lethal once our back's against the wall. A fair amount of opponents might try to take their time against us, so we get the least out of our leader ability, so we don't keep looping that last life, seeing more cards, so Flampe can help build our hand up and get us closer to those extra heals. We don't have the Amaru activation condition to worry about in this list, but we really want to see those big bodies, so getting 2 cards deeper can go a long way as we move through our curve. And the 2-cost Shirahoshi blocker is another addition we got in EB01, and I love playing this card. Since she heals a life when she's KO'd by an effect, she always requires another attack from our opponent to get lethal, unless we're against Law or Blue deck, in which case she still has counter. It also feels great playing her alongside Katakuri on Tendon, so that we can tuck something on the opponent's board while still figuratively healing, or just going ham on our defenses. Our other 2-cost is Onami. This trigger to KO a 5-cost character can steal games, and is our one out to characters like Borsalino. We're not often using the banish for the sake of it, but another one of my favorite plays is giving that banish to either our leader, or ideally one of our higher cost characters that are already in play, then using another A-cost Katakuri to put her back into our life, and making the opponent have to try and play around her. Getting into some 2Ks, Beige is still goated, he's still protecting the homestead, and just look at this guy. No remorse, not a care in the world. And we have a new 2K in Frankie from set 7. This trigger was made for Enel, and it's pure power creep. You know, a year ago, in OP03, back in my day, our trigger characters made us discard one to play him. Then the Wano characters were dependent on our opponent's life, but Frankie, 1, draws us a card, and he gets to hit the field just by virtue of Enel doing what it's meant to do. Plus he swings 5k with no investment, and did I mention he's a 2k? One that we can put back in our life with a cost Katakuri? The card's busted. Your opinions may vary on the source material, but as far as Bandai's concerned, Egghead is Frankie's arc. Couple old favorites coming in next here. The 5-cost Shirahoshi is always welcome off of trigger, but if we don't have removal on 5, if our opponent doesn't give us a good target, or if we just need to fix our hand, we can hard play her in the mid-game to then filter some cards, and you guessed it, Sarah to life with Katakuri to keep the value going. Yeah, it doesn't get old. Gadatsu comes in handy against black decks like he has in previous sets, and against Law. As long as they don't play that 2-cost Sanji, he can easily get rid of a body and bait out their removal in the hopes that we run them out, so our big characters can take care of the game in 1 or 2 goes. Of course, there are some matchups where Gadatsu isn't going to help us against 5-cost characters since our opponent is multicolored. And that's where the loss of Reject really starts to hurt us, but we have a nice alternative. The yellow Sabo from Star Deck 13 didn't see much play in Black-Yellow Luffy, but he has managed to find a home here in Enel. He clears a 5-cost, think the yellow Luffy, think 5-cost Kid, even Cavendish or Gadatsu in the mirror. This removal is not contingent on either player's life total, and it then gets us closer to our lead ability, even if we have to trash one of those lives on the way. And then 7-cost Big Mom saw a fair amount of play in post-ban set 7. If you go first, she is an amazing play on turn 4 to reduce our opponent's access to cards in the long run, or to give us one extra card as the game goes on. In that time frame where she's best, to me that's a win-win, but she's very matchup dependent. She won't do much for you against Law, but if you're against Black, if you're against a majority of the decks in the format, she is still great in that spot. 2 feels good to me, but she is very cuttable if you're not vibing with her. Now, I've already discussed the ways that 8-cost Katakuri can combo with our smaller characters, but there are plenty of targets he can hit on the opponent's board. Moria, Kid, opposing 8-cost Katakuri, but he also shines against Law. If you give Law a 5th life, you're making every single one of their characters, with the possible exception of Ace, susceptible to our removal effects. And when it comes to that Ace, he's probably one of our best options to tuck since he's their biggest body and doesn't have counter. Yamato's still great for healing from 1 or 0 life while getting a potential KO. Now, if your opponent's keeping you at 2 to prevent that heal, and if you're looking for more bodies or maybe a Kingdom Come, and you're willing to get a little spicy, you could even play Flampe first for an effective draw 2 while still passing with 2 life. But, as with all these little silly, spicy plays, just weigh the potential trade-off of losing out on Yamato's KO by bringing you down to 1, or not drawing the counter to make up for Flampe if you're going to try this. And in a deck that thrives off of gigantic, high-cost characters, Yamato's no longer the ceiling. Our new boss character is the secret rare 10-cost Ace from set 7. On play, he heals you regardless of your current life total, and then if you're at 2 or less life, he gets to rush for 10k. This is the kind of range we look for with our Yamato shenanigans, so he fits perfectly in here and does wonders when we want to close the game out or get another attack on our opponent's board to make sure that we're not going to lose the next turn. When it comes to these high-cost characters, any one of them could be the right option once you get to those Tendon turns. It all depends on the particulars of the game state, so if you have options, figure out what you need most each turn, and just keep those big drops coming. We're also running 2 different events, both at a full 4 copies. You're the One Who Should Disappear turns our extra non-counters into value. 18's not the worst amount of non-counter, but running 4 copies also gives us the highest chance of putting it into life with our leader ability, and then getting a second heal on our opponent's turn. And then Kingdom Come is our answer to characters that our other removal isn't going to reach, especially 9-drop Zoro, as well as Ace, Yamato in the mirror if the timing is right, as well as those slightly smaller but still threatening characters when we don't have access to Katakuri, or we don't want to put in our opponent's life. If you're in a matchup where you don't expect a lot of problems with taller characters and you're already low on life, and especially if you have multiple copies in hand, you can even use it on curve at 6, and then the trigger, which is essentially a Yamato KO effect, can put us ahead if we hit it early on. That's our list. Let's move into the card counts. You'll see off the bat that 9 of these cards are played in over 90% of lists. Everybody's running 4 Shirahoshi. Absolutely mandatory. Beige surprisingly drops off a little bit. And then once you get to Shirahoshi, Linlin, Sabo, and Nami, we get into some more territory that has varied opinion among players. But they are still in the majority. Getting into these spicier picks, some players were opting for vanillas, Perospero if you really want something on 6 that isn't Raigo, Compote if you want to be able to hit 9 against Black Yellow Luffy, if you want another 7-drop that isn't as conditional or matchup dependent as 7 Mom. The new Luffy that had so many nicknames, Spacesuit Luffy, Egg Luffy, Anpanman Luffy, look up Anpanman. I didn't realize that was even a reference Oda was making with these new suits. Awesome. He saw play in about a quarter of these decks in pre-ban and post-ban. I thought he was more popular pre-ban, but he was always a little on the fringe side. You can get a KO on a 4-cost either by seeing him off of trigger or by using his activate main effect, and the main effect even draws you a card, which Enel loves. I feel like board presence is a big part of this format if we're able to have it. And if I had to choose between him and Sabo, I'd rather have that access to KO a 5-cost. Amaru's cheeky, though not as much of a necessity since we don't have to worry about Sakazuki anymore. I guess I could see some situations where it could come in handy against Law, especially if they have one of their 4 or 3-cost blockers on field. But I don't know how reliable that would be. I think Law is usually going to try and finish us off in 1 turn. And as much as I like heal triggers, giving up 2 cards for a heal trigger doesn't sound as fun to me. Rush Ace is valid. I like him. I think we just have better 5-costs. Nothing wrong with him. There's just other choices I'd rather play. Elthor's cool. Yellow Radical Beam, I'll always respect it. Personally, I want to use on my Doan. Every turn. Every single turn. Like a solid 95% of my turns. And then we had a couple builds adding a Wano package in. To me, Hiyori feels like she's in a similar place with Ace, Still a good card. I for one, love stacking triggers. I think Frankie just bumped her space out. He kind of, well, he and the Blocker Shirahoshi kind of bumped Kikunojo out of the list as well. At this point, if I'm getting a trigger character, I don't want to pay for it. I'm spoiled now. Thanks, Frankie. And Shirahoshi's heal is much, much less conditional at this point. There were a couple of the promo 6-cost 8k vanilla Kozuki Momonosuke as well. They're lumped in with Perospero as far as the math goes. Thunderbolt's another control option here. Does hit 5-cost on play. Doesn't have counter. If you're looking for more than the Sabo, I could see it. But I'm not, like, fiending for it. And I'd love to see a Brûlé off trigger. I just don't want to. I don't want to see it off trigger against Law. And then we got our little Hey Arnold looking homie Edison over here. Another 2k option on play. If you have 2 or less life, you can draw 2, trash 2. The filter's cool. Don't get the trigger though, because we're not playing Old Man Vegapunk. It's just the same thing where he's outclassed by some other 2Ks. Not a bad card. As far as our cuts go, these are beautifully organized compared to the ones in the other videos. Sorry, I'm not gonna cry. I'm not gonna cry about it. A Disappear or a Frankie are easily shavable. If you're not feeling the Linlin, if Onami doesn't cut the mustard for you, and if you don't feel like giving up that life off Sabo, all fair game to substitute for something else. That 5-cost Luffy was very close to making the cut, and then as you may have seen in the card count slides, more people played Linlin at 4 than they did at 2. It's just that the list playing her at 2 had higher achievements than the 4-ofs. Beyond that, some people went for a 3rd Sabo, and there is a solid argument to be made for these vanillas. And there we have it. That is Enel in set 7. In my own testing, he was the bar with which I compared every other deck I tried. There are still a couple potential contenders, but for me, what strategies I tend to click with, it's between him and number 1 for me. I won't lie, I've got I'm tracking my expected win rate through 6 different metrics. 3 of them say Enel, 3 of them say number 1. Hopefully I have a decision made by the time Gen Con hits and I have a big tournament. Hopefully. Number 3 is one of the newer decks on the block. He performed decently at the end of OP06 in EB01, and he gets one of the biggest boosts from Sakazuki's absence. Black Yellow Luffy. As you'll see from this list, there are not a lot of new inclusions here in the deck list, so the strategy is pretty much unchanged, but this leader is inherently powerful and we get a helpful tool in set 7. I'm gonna try not to spend too much time on the cards that I've covered in the earlier video. I'll mainly be going over any new tips or insight that I've picked up from my set 7 testing and a lot from these note articles I read in preparation. I'll link a couple of my favorites in the description. During the early game, we're going to start assembling our game pieces, try to find the 3 brothers cards we need. Mid-game, we organize our hand a little more and solidify a plan to get our leader effect going. Then by turn 4 or 5, we want to be at 0 life so we can start cheating out our 5-cost brothers and pumping our leader up to 9,000. For most decks, as the game goes on, our hand is going to decrease in value and our life will become more valuable, but for Black Yellow Luffy, that's very much the opposite. Our hand is our biggest resource since in the late game, 1 counter stops a 9k swing. We're putting ourselves on a bit of a timer by playing this way, so unless we absolutely need to get rid of a 7k or higher character, we just want to swing hard into our opponent's life. This deck has a linear concept since we're always looking to get to the same general setup, but how we get there when our opponent tries to impede it and then plan our turns in advance lead to a lot of different decision trees that make our approach vary according to the matchup we see and what tools we have access from the beginning of the game. Sometimes we try to hit a quick peak in power to finish our opponent off as soon as the opportunity arises, or sometimes we draw things out with continuous 5-cost spam and use that combo until we're out of cards. 3 Brothers Bond and Garp search out our many Ace, Sabo, and Luffy cards. It's very tempting to play these on turn 1 as soon as we can, but we also don't want to run into the problem of seeing an uncomboable group of brothers because we draw duplicates, so waiting and deciding based off of our draws is pretty useful whenever we can. The main reason we'd want to use Garp on turn 1 is if we think we need to get 2 swings in on turn 2. Mainly against Lucci, potentially Law, Bonney if we want to KO one of their searchers and still hit them with our lead. There's always a chance you could see Moria on one of these, but the deck usually gets through at least half of its cards, and sometimes even loops through the whole thing, so we might as well play to our outs and put him at the top of those cards we're sending to the bottom. This deck is much more of a known quantity now than it was 2 months ago, so the player base has a much better idea of how it works and how to make things more difficult. We love it if we can get to 0 life and use our leader ability solely by virtue of our opponent hitting us, but if not, our 2Ks are indispensable. Indispensable to the point that there's an argument to be made that we should mulligan for them specifically over our Searchers, Sabo, or Moria. There's always a chance we can draw those combo pieces as the game goes on, but we really can't do much if we get starved out of our leader effect and don't have any way to eat through our life. As a rule of thumb, we like seeing 2 of them to be safe, but the best thing a Luffy player can do is, as soon as possible, figure out their plan and what conditions they need to be in control of their leader ability and get it going by turn 5, while not being on the edge of lethal too soon. We really don't want to delay it any further than that. Our opponent's just going to get more and more big bodies as time goes on, and that'll cut away at the value this ability gives us. Of these 2Ks, these depleters, Flampe is our priority since she only costs 1 and then nets us card advantage. And Makino is the most debated. Lists have her anywhere from 2 to 4. It can be tough because she gives us the most information when we use her early game, but using her then might give certain matchups a little more flexibility in when they can start swinging at us. If we do put her down, we have a chance to set up a brother combo, a bro combo, a calm bro, without having to use our ability. If we see a 5-cost brother corresponding to one of the 2 costs in our hand, we're best off placing it second from the bottom. It's tempting to bury them right at the bottom, but our opponent might expect that, and they often won't leave you at 1 life regardless, since you'd only need 1 more depleter in order to get to 0 life. More often, they'll attack only when they have more attacks than we do life and blockers. If this does happen and we don't defend early, then we just need to give up more and more cards to stay alive as those attacks ramp up. Otherwise, they just get to stop once we counter and they've gotten a card or 2 out of our hand. It's not as bad as it could be. We haven't lost the game yet. But when 1 card can get us out of a 9K, we really don't want to have to use them on anything smaller. But either way, it's a tough spot. We're not going to be as happy as we could be either way. But in that case, we can take 1 or 2 of those hits to give up a lower amount and survive, but still have that 5 cost we've placed on the horizon, or just 1 depleter away. If we can get to 8 or 9 Don with a mostly full hand, a 7K lead, and 1 or 2 life this way, we've avoided the worst and we have room to work. If we see a second 5 cost that corresponds with a 2 cost in hand, we can put that one right to the bottom. And as far as any 2Ks we see, those can go right to the top. As she did in this past format, Hiyori has lots of utility, but I'm going to wait to get into a maneuver or 2 with her beyond that usual raw play from hand switcheroo when I talk about Moria. I don't really have much new to say about the 2-cost brothers. I'm not sure I mentioned how helpful they are to counter with when we're in those 9K Moria loop turns. What I will say is that if we only see 1 Moria or none at all, we do not want to discard these off of Sabo, and sometimes you'll want to have 1 set up on the field the turn before you start looping the lead ability. It's very useful to save Ace for last when we can, and if we anticipate 4 cost blockers, the Luffy's going to come in handy too. Ivankov saw considerably more play in OP07, and 1 copy made it into this list. 1-ofs aren't very common in One Piece, but they basically act as a 5th Hiyori to give us another depletion option. The fact that they're a blocker also gives us more value as we move toward that lead ability, and also requires Law to use a reducer to tuck them. Moving into our 5 costs, I don't really think I gave the Star Deck Luffy the credit he deserves in that old video. We do have options to turn this leader ability on manually, but I can't stress this enough. Every card in our hand is a commodity, so doing so without losing a 2K and then drawing another card is going to be our best bet. At this point, I place him on the same priority as Sabo for our mulligan, if not higher. Against Law and Bonney, he is our go-to turn 3 play. Turn 4 versus Enel so that he ensures the leader ability. I will say that if you're behind against Enel, do not attack with him before you hit 0 in that matchup. Opinions are honestly pretty split on whether you play him turn 3 or turn 4 versus black. At first, I was thinking after, that way we are a little further along in our plan. We might already have a Sabo on the board. But now I'm starting to lean toward turn 3, because unless when we reach turn 4, we already have a 5-cost Sabo that we know is on top of our life, and we bring him out with the 2-cost Sabo, he doesn't have immunity, and then Lucci just has more cards to KO with him when they're at 8 or 9. You know, a Moria Lucci Helmeppo combo easily outs him. Plus, he just has so much value as an attacker in the late game. All that being said, the answer likely depends on the plan you set based on that opening hand, and any other particulars that come up in those first couple turns. If we can safely use his ability twice, we're in a great place, and we also want to get as many out as possible in order to try and salvage the Bonney matchup, which it sucks. I'm going to tell you right now, it sucks. But at least he hits a cost Cade without any investment. The new Egghead Luffy gives us that little bit of control we need. We could play the 5-cost Sabo from the starter deck, but he's not doing anything once we hit 0 life. But once we get low, this Luffy KOs small blockers, and those harder to deal with characters like Shiraya and Bon Clay against Law, and then draws us a card. And the fact that he immediately goes to the trash actually helps us versus Law and against any other blue decks, so that we always have a target to send to life off our leader ability. We still love Black Sabo, gives us the consistency we need, and shuts down KO strategies, especially if we just keep on looping him, but discarding the wrong cards with him is debilitating. In most circumstances, we're pretty safe to discard our 5-cost characters. But if we end up needing it for a Hiyori combo, or if we don't have the 2-cost brother we need in trash for a Moria turn that we start off at 1 life, we've basically rowed our dinghy out to sea right next to a spoiled billionaire. And if our only option to avoid lethal when our opponent finally attacks us is giving up 2 cards from hand, he saves our value. Ace is great in the late game, so he's fine at 3, same with the Egghead Luffy. We're not too worried about protecting him from attacks, but if he stays on board, it's very nice to swing with him and then send him into the trash with the 2-cost ace before we use our leader ability. And now it's combo time. Standard Moria combo is, start at 0 life, use our lead ability, revive 2 of our 2-cost brothers, transform them both, get to 9k, but some decks can break through that. And it's something we want to be considering as soon as we hit 8 Dawn. If we get to 8, and we have 1 life and 1 of the 5 costs in our trash, we can move toward our ultimate board state. So to do this, we start with Hiyori, we switch our last life out with a 5-cost character from our hand, we play the corresponding 2-cost, transform it, our leader is at 7k. That's when we use the leader effect. We then get 2 5-costs in our life, we play the 2-cost corresponding with our top life, ideally Sabo. So that way we've got 2 5-cost characters, a 9k leader, and 1 life. From there, as long as you start that 10 Don turn at 1 life, you play Moria, bring out the 2-cost brother that corresponds to the one on top of your life, transform that one before the effect, and then you'll have this same 9k leader plus 1 life setup. When you're selecting that bottom life, you do have to be conscious of the fact that it could end up at the bottom of your deck if your opponent does swing into it, but that extra durability could be the difference between continuing the game or losing. This next point is more so from the articles than my testing. I still want to get a few more games in with this deck, but I've been led to believe that this setup is very effective versus Law, the Mirror, Yamato, and against Blue. Another combo, if you don't see Hiyori, if you still end up at 1 life when you hit 10, is using Moria to bring out Flampe and a 2-cost brother, ideally Sabo, and that can let you get to 7k leader, 1 life left, and a blocker. This gets us ready to establish that ultimate board state I just talked about, and if that revival target is Sabo, then this is still a generally safe board state if you just hit 10. And then potentially if you put a 2-cost brother on board the turn before you hit 10, and if your 5-cost Luffy stays alive until that point, that lets you do the Hiyori combo, or you can bring back Garp and a 2-cost to then get an extra card, 5-cost Luffy to life, use your leader ability, and then you still get to 9k. In an ideal world, I would have either done a gameplay demo, or I would have been able to make some nice graphics detailing these combos. I'm very sadly behind schedule on these. I was hoping to get this out earlier today, and I still have to write another script and record one if I want to stay on pace for tomorrow, so I did have to put that by the wayside. I'm very sorry. Hopefully, a time will come down the line when I'm able to have a bit more flexibility in my production, and I can add some nice visual aids in the future. But let's get into some stats. This deck is, it's so uniform just given the combo nature of it, given the way this leader ability is designed to work. Everything you see on this page is played in more than 95% of these decks. There were a couple, I think there was one deck that decided to go no Sabo, one deck that decided to go no Ace. Some were getting a little funky with these ace ratios. That's actually a point that's going to come up when we get to the cuts and additions. But there were some more under-the-radar picks. Ivankov made it into this list. A couple even played them at 2. One was at 3. And Black Yellow Luffy's biggest weakness, outside of the fact that it's on a timer when it comes to countering from hand, is the fact that it doesn't have a way to deal with characters of 5 cost or above. At least when it comes to this very standardized build. A couple players did focus on workarounds. 3 lists ran the yellow Sabo. I don't think he's a bad card if you're putting him in addition to the other brothers that we run. It's hard to find the space. That's my only thing. 10 cost Kuzan does get rid of those 5 cost characters immediately, which can be a huge boon, against Law, in the mirror, to get rid of that Cavendish and Bonney. And he then puts that 9 cost Zoro, which is the bane of our existence, in range of the Egghead Luffy, also called Rocket Luffy. I found another nickname for this card. 4 cost Kuzan, Ice Age, Thunderbolt, all fill that same role, just at different timings. If I'm being completely honest, I have not tried these cards myself. The articles on Note didn't even really touch on them that much, so if you've used these yourself and you have had any luck with them, I am all ears, and I'm very interested in trying them, if, you can find the space. Oh, right, that's the slide we're on right now. So, I'll start with the additions. Some people played up to 3 Ivankov. One thing I forgot to mention about them is that we could bring the Ivankov off with Moria, and then just make our leader 7k since so many of their characters are just 5ks. Some opt to bring Makino or Ace up to 4 as well. Those spots are extremely flexible. And then we start getting into those other control options. When we get to the cuts, though, it's a little wonky, I guess, just because, there's only so much room we have. The Ivankov and the 3rd Makino, very easily cuttable. From there is a big drop-off as far as, deviance from the norm. The first tier of that deviance would be reducing the 2 cost Ace to 1 and the 5 cost to 2. You'll see I've got more than 10 cards listed here. It's at 14. It's because when we get to that second tier of degeneracy, really, tier 2.5 if we're getting into the crazy nitty-gritty of tier lists, but the 4 Sabo, the 2 5 cost Ace, and that last 2 cost Ace all scored exactly the same, just because of the way this is going. And, those are some deeper cuts to be making, so there's just as much pause to be given there. But if you really want to tech this out, take it in a different direction, these are the ways that other players have made that work. And there is Black Yellow Luffy. I love this deck. I think that I personally am going to need a little more testing to feel as confident as I do with my 2 current top picks, but it's very strong, especially if you're not going to see a lot of Bonney. If you vibe with this sort of deck, if you enjoy being trolly, cheating characters out, long-term planning, then pick it up, play some games. Number 2 is another new leader from OP07, a leader I've been very glad to see doing well, just because, this is one of the villains that I caught up the story with, I just gotta give him props. This is the new control deck on the block. If you miss Sakazuki, there's a good chance you're gonna like playing Lucci. Lucci is a 5-life black leader, and when attacking, you can discard the top 2 cards of your deck to give one of your opponent's characters -1 to their cost. The past 6 months have shown us that -1 cost on attack opens the door for control strategies. Lucci doesn't have the same filtering capabilities that Sakazuki has, but that's probably for the best. We can just leave that in the past. The only thing that can potentially hurt about milling cards as opposed to discarding them from hand is that sometimes we'll drop a Moria that we can't retrieve, but our strongest effects demand that we fill the trash up. So outside of some rare, very unlucky scenarios, this mill is a boon, and this enables our deck to work. Plus, the fact that this is on attack does let us play some mind games with our opponent now and then. If you just start the turn off swinging for 5 and reducing something, there's a chance your opponent might let it through because they thought you had the KO. But getting into the list, this is one of the few black decks that only plays 3 copies of Suru. She is a very efficient reduction card, but we also want to make sure that we have enough room for our Cypher Pole characters, of which we have abundant 2Ks. If you know me, and you've listened to my thoughts and reactions to Water 7 and East Lobby, you know that I hate Spandam so much. But he grabs our pieces while he gets us closer to the magic number of 10 cards in our trash, so I'm giving him a pass this time. I'm not forgiving him, but I'll let him work for me. Okay, I'm good. So with all this trashing that our leader ability does, Helmeppo can easily find his way there, and he contributes to the now classic Moria Helmeppo Lucci combo in our late game. Now, with the trash being the prerequisite for some of our reduction, removal, or resurrection cards, when it comes to the early game, we like to prioritize removal that won't deplete that trash. So 2 copies of Brook from EB01 smooth those turns out. If we swing our lead, then playing from hand, he lets us KO a 2 cost on play, and if we have our stage out, that brings us up to 4. And while we aren't bringing cards back from the trash as much as, say, Moria, Spandine gives us some recursion specifically for Cypher Pole. By sending 3 of our Cypher Pole cards from the trash to the bottom of the deck, we can then resurrect a 4-cost or less Cypher Pole character, oftentimes Lucci, to get more multi-character removal off. If we do this, then we'll still have to send another 3 for the Lucci effect, so this does cost a fair amount of resources. But since we can play him off of Rebecca, this lets us get a double KO and a blocker for 4 dome. So as long as this combo comes at a time when we already have a healthy trash, or can easily fill it back up, that trash cost is very much offset, and we still have plenty of room to combo with our reduction if this happens in the late game. And speaking of the late game, we can make this happen with Moria as well. He could also grab our 4-cost Kaku or Khalifa to filter and or reduce in some select circumstances. In addition to that Spandine combo, Rebecca also lets us resurrect Brook for extra KOs, and retrieves our 2Ks, our blockers, our removers, standard princess things. Red Purple Law's leader effect does out her very easily, as does Luffy with their new 5-cost, so if you want to switch some copies of her out for Borsellino, that's not unheard of at all, especially if you want an edge in the mirror. As for Khalifa, she is a 2K, a 2-cost reducer, and lets us draw 2 and trash 2 to give us consistency and fuel our trash. If we don't need to get a Lucci KO or set up a blocker on 4, she is a very valid play, but getting her in the trash to fuel our Spandine, our Lucci, and our Kaku is also a priority. Then the new Kaku from OP07 is our other Cypher Pole 2K, and he lets us reduce a character's cost by 3. He's probably the least used of our reducers since he costs 4 to play from hand, and then requires us to send 2 more Cypher Pole cards to the bottom of our deck. He's usually best used as cost from the trash after we've countered with him, like Khalifa. And among black decks, Lucci's strength is its ability to KO multiple characters at once with the 4-cost Lucci. If we counter out of our opponent's first swing and then use our leader ability on 4 or 5, we can use this effect immediately. And just like in Sakazuki, he puts in an incredible amount of work off of Moria. We have a couple mid-cost KO characters we can use in the mid-game, and the ideal choice is really going to depend on whether we want to save counter in hand or cards in our trash. And the second of those options is the set 3 Kaku, who can KO a 3-cost on play, 4 with lead, 6 with lead and stage, and he costs less trash-wise, But since he has counter, we sometimes want to use Lucci given the option, even if there's only one character we need to KO. All of it's going to depend on what your priority is at that given moment. Now, over the course of this week, I have already sung Sabo's praises on 3 separate occasions. All I'll say is that, once again, he gives us trash synergy and helps us a lot in Black Mirrors, but he has just as much utility as an attacker to pressure our opponent and make them think twice about investing into a huge body if we're just a teeny bit short in our removal. As always, Moria is great on 8, but if we play him on 9 or 10 with one of our events, the ceiling just goes higher. The basic Lucci Helmeppo combo can KO 2 characters whose costs add up to 6, our leader ability brings that to 7, the Eni's Lobby stage brings it to 9, then if we add a Tempest leg, we are KOing a sum of 12, if we use Ice Age instead, that goes up to 14, and then if we use both of those events, a Tempest leg and Ice Age, we'll KO 17 total. Not a ton of turns like that, but for the sake of theory, that's the ceiling of our Moria-Lucci combo. But that being said, Moria is not the end-all be-all of our late-game plays. We have a couple different high-end options if we either don't see the Moria, or we think there's a better turn to use him on. As a quick disclaimer, this data list is a bit teched out with multiple one-ofs from the algorithm. People had a bunch of different combinations for how they ran this suite, and there's lots of room to switch these around given your own priorities and your own metagame, and even how you enjoy playing this deck personally. If you get to 8 or 9 and your opponent's characters have KO resistance, or if they have enough cards in hand and you can benefit from more reduction next turn, Isho can provide a nice path into the end of your curve. And if he stays on the board, then those KOs just get more and more feasible. But as far as that hand reduction goes, if our opponent has more than 7 in hand at the start of the turn, we can start with a 5k leader swing to make them potentially send a counter, and then still get 2 potentially more important cards out of their hand with that Isho effect. In fact, it might even be worth foregoing the KO strategy for this one turn, even if our opponent doesn't have resistance, since it's very likely we'll be getting multiple KOs the next turn, and we'll be able to catch up. And to that end, the 8-cost Sabo is our other option for multiple character KOs, with his wide range of 5 and 3. With the leader effect, we can take out a 5 and 4, 5-cost kid, one of lost 4 costs. With our leader ability and a reduction event, he's hitting any 2 of lost characters, or an opposing Moria and the resulting 4 cost versus black, as well as multiple other configurations. We can max out at 9 and 10 if we have the stage in our events. The math is mathing with this guy. But if you do not want to do math, and you just want to destroy something tall, Stussy can just KO anything for 9 Dawn. Only cost is that we have to get rid of one of our characters from the board. In a perfect world, we could search her out with Spandom at the start of the turn, and then just send him for the effect, because, get that guy out of here. But sometimes you won't have a choice that easy. So her value can be very subjective depending on one's own play preferences and the given game state. As with our single copy of Isho, one Stussy could be unreliable, but having this wide assortment of 9k bodies can give us versatility in our responses and a consistent way to hit our Black Yellow Luffy matchup. It's just a very good thing, once again, that we don't have that same filter as Sokka. Then we'd be just getting into some unfun territory. But if you want to talk fun, let's talk a more conditional but more efficient version of Great Eruption. Tempest Leg is nuts. As long as we have 10 in our trash, meaning that we have to consider every Cypher Pull effect we use very carefully, we draw 1 and give something -3. The applications, as mentioned before, are incredible. Even if you hit 10 in your trash early on, hold on to these as long as you can. Chances are they'll come in handiest after you're both at 10 Dawn and your opponent finally plays their biggest threats. Same goes for Ice Age. As soon as you see the leader across from you, figure out what you want to save these for. Against Bonney, be Zoro and Kid, for example. Only exception to that is Law. In that matchup, there does stand a decent chance that we don't even get to 10 in our trash by the end of the game, so the draw on its own might be a little more useful against him. Finally, we have Eni's Lobby, an amazing stage that finally has the leader to match. A -2 every turn shores our math right up. It's not the only way to get through the game, so we don't need to play 4, especially since there are some turns in our curve where playing this is very inopportune. But if we see it turn 1 going second, turn 2 going first, or even turn 4 going first, we love slapping this down. Or we just get lucky off these 5 life and hit it off our trigger. This guy's a beast. If you like combo, he's got your combos. But getting into our card count stats, this entire top row and those 2 Kakus are both played in every single build. Suru in 97%, Stage goes down to 84, and then Stussy, 2-cost Brook, Helmet Bow, Sabo are a bit more subjective, but still in the majority. We see Ice Age just under 50, with more people running 2 copies than 1. 2 copies sounds great to me. This list just gets very, very tight, and the algorithm only had room for the 1. But in my testing, I had actually played a fair amount of games with an earlier version of the algorithm list, and the 6-cost Brook really came in handy for me. That 5-cost Sabo is popular. Borsalino's still a relevant card, and there will be times when we need removal on those turns. Plus, regardless of the KO versus put in trash distinction, he has the highest base reach of our mid-cost removal characters, so he can hit some highs that Kaku might not be able to on a given turn. Isho and Borsalino did both make it into this list, 1 copy being rare for both of them, so keep that in mind as you tweak your own ratios as you test this deck out. I also find Nightmare Luffy to be a very interesting inclusion in the same vein as Brook. He only trashes a 2-cost before our other reduction, but he trashes instead of KOs. Plus his ability to send 4-cost characters to the bottom of deck from our trash and then power himself up for every 3 can give us that extra swing we need against Black Yellow Luffy. It's all just a question of timing and how long he stays on the board. EBO1 also gave Black its own variant of Jet Pistol with Finger Gun. Milling 2 is so very in line with our game plan, and 5-cost is the big number in this format. The only question is whether or not generating a character is worth that trade-off. If you decide you want to be as consistent and voluminous as possible with those non-counter cards, 6 King Gun is going to come in very handy to give you the defense you need. And Yusuf is a very cheap KO option if you're good with the resource management of this deck and have the reduction to spare. Then the rest of these were only played in 1 list each. Hina and Kuzan are both such generically good black staples. Just gotta find the room for them in a deck like this. Honestly, if I see someone counter with Hattori, I'm just... They win, spiritually. I love seeing the little pigeon man. That's great. Thematic play is always welcome. But he is still a Cypher card. He is still fuel for those effects. Honestly, if I just hear that someone wins a tournament because of the extra power Hattori gave their Lucci... highlight of the format for me. I would love that. Please, someone make that happen. And then I see this nifty single copy of Hogback to get a Moria from the trash that we mill or gets KO'd. I don't know how often it's gonna happen, but I see you. It's nifty. That's a neat pick. As I have alluded to, this list in particular has lots of room for edits. The one-ofs, Isho, Borsalino, Ice Age, Stussy, they're all fair game. You can reduce or even take out the Sabo. Cut down on the Suru because we have other 2K options. Maybe for a Hattori, even though he's not on this slide. I'm just kidding. Or even playing 1 Helmeppo. Very, very valid. Personally, I'm itching to get back to 1 of the 6-cost Brook. You can also max out your Beckies, or add a second Borsalino if that KO immunity is important to you. 4th Kaku if we really want to round out those Cypher pull cards. And then we can increase our Isho, 5-cost Sabo, max out the stage, add a second Stussy, second Brook, and the other Kaku as well. Between you and me, Kaku getting a happy ending is one of my number 1 agendas for the series, so if I gotta play 4 of each version of him, then that's a sacrifice that I am willing to make. But that's Lucci. Man, oh man, this is a fun deck. Depending on whether we share the same philosophy, control and fun may or may not be synonymous to you, but there's so many lines of play with this deck. There is so much chefitude with how you build your list. I've learned something every game I played with Lucci. There is so much to explore here. And if you just like Water 7, Ennie's Lobby, the Cypherable characters, then here you go. You can finally play them in a great deck. And here we go. This is my favorite character in the entire series, one of my favorite leaders ever printed, the king of OP07, Trafalgar Law. If you've been following the One Piece card game discourse, there is lots of discussion about his performance in OP08 right now. Based on the data I have so far, I could not be in greater agreement that something needs to be done in Asia right now. But as far as OP07 goes, I think we're good to chill for a second. I think that Law is unquestionably the best deck, and is on the edge of being too good, but firmly behind that boundary. This may be a hot take, and I may do some data analysis and maybe make some content if I ever find the time. Haha, we've all heard that one before, to figure out, statistically what the best format is, but this may be one of the best formats that we've had. Anyway, this leader ability has the perfect blend of control and aggro that rewards skillful play and punishes mistakes. So seeing him just barely in that tier 0 by my own metrics really feels relatively good to me. There's only going to be one OP07 card in this data list, but there were some changes to the build after the ban hit. More than almost any other deck, Law relies much more on a holistic understanding of a matchup and reactions to an individual game state than a specific curve to go off of every time. And the Mulligan is no different. We want a nice blend of ramp, reducers, and our other utility cards, our draw, our rush, our blockers, prioritized generally in that order. If we were to distill this into a general Mulligan strategy, you need to have a 3-cost going first, a 4-cost going second, and then you want to get your ramp ASAP to then be able to develop that board and net your advantage. The data gave us a total of 10 power reducers, 4 each of Gordon, Raise Max for maximum consistency. For me, it feels better to see one too many than to get caught without them. And Otama rounds out our suite of 2Ks while still being able to take care of 5Ks without giving the most reduction that we have. Shiraya will always let us block and save him for 1K counter or swing at the opponent's leader, no matter how high it is, which is huge for the Black-Yellow Luffy matchup. In that matchup, he might be more of an attacker than a blocker, since the Egghead Luffy outs him very easily. Chopper gets considerably more play in Set 7 than he did in EB01. His attack effect is the biggest draw here, basically a Gordon or a Raise Max that can swing. Our opponent is going to swing into him almost whenever they can, so in that case he's a pseudo-blocker, but he's also an actual blocker once we get to the endgame. And then our homie, our wonderful friend Bone Clay slaps in any matchup with tall characters, and in OP07, that's going to be a lot of them, especially versus yellow and green, and he ramps on play, so he is great to see in our opening hand. And speaking of ramp cards that we love seeing in our opening hand, Ein gets us an extra Don on play, and she swings for 5k. If we play her on turn 2 going second, she will get us to 7 Don turn 3, and that is great for playing a 5-cost kid, then using the leader effect to play a 4-cost, and then having 3 Don left over to play another character. And then if that 4-cost you played off the leader effect is also a ramp card, then you could just play another 4-cost that turn. The control capabilities this deck has are wonderful, but flooding the board is how this deck really wins games. And once that time comes to win the game, Kid and Killer is the game ender, and he is what you're playing around in the mirror. If you see another Law across the table, your priority is to get them to 2 life as soon as possible and make sure that they do not get to do that to you first. But the most undisputable card in this deck is Shachi and Penguin from Starter Deck 10. They are the gold standard turn 1. If you see them with Kid, that ramp is just as important as their 2K status, if not more so. Now 4-cost Law is helpful in almost any matchup this format, but shotgunning him immediately in any matchup that isn't Luffy or maybe Enel is tough if you're going to be using your lead ability as well. Keeping enough Don to play multiple characters is paramount, But if you can time him well near the end, that's one of the nuances that sets the really good Law players apart. Reiju gives us longevity and consistency through her card draw, and she's the card that propelled the deck's initial rise, but as I've alluded to, she isn't necessarily our specific mulligan. Seeing cards is great, but the first advantage we want to have is Dawn, then our board, and then our hand comes after. However, if you are against the Mirror or another purple deck, always be on the lookout for the times when her ability is live, and double check when you're about to put her down. 5-cost Kid is our tsundere bestie, no doubt about that. Getting him out on 5 is always great. It facilitates our resources. But 7 Dawn is that sweet spot. That way we can play him, use our lead ability, and still have enough Dawn to get 2 characters out afterward. I mentioned that main pattern at 7 when I talked about Ein, but if he's already out, we could play a 4-cost, use our lead ability, generate 1 with him, then play a 4-cost or another 5-cost, or start with a 3-cost, use our leader ability, get 1, play another 5-cost, or reduce one of those characters you play by 1 before the leader ability for a power reducer. As anyone who is already familiar with the deck knows, he is the linchpin of our resource stability. He lets us maintain the Dawn that we need to get that board advantage that carries us through. Now, historically, I've been a little back and forth on Queen, since he's more of a jack of all trades and sets our Dawn back when we play him. But with so many decks gearing up to KO 4 costs specifically in reaction to Law, another 5-cost blocker is the way to go. But why stop at a 5-cost 6k blocker when we could have a 3-cost 6k blocker? As long as we have at least 2 fewer Dawn than our opponent, we can play the set 7 Sanji for 3. Then he can swing for 6k, he can block. If we don't choose to play him, he's a 2k counter, and he will bait our opponent's control resources out. In my mind, at least, he is an instant 4-of. The same guidance applies for him as Reiju. Always be conscious of when you can or cannot play him for 3. I personally had a few losses because I either forgot it was 2 less Dawn or didn't fully think the Dawn changes in my sequencing through. Learn from my mistakes, or just maybe you won't make them. There's a reason I might be playing Enel instead. One notable omission from this list is the 7-cost Ace from set 2. I was quite surprised not to see him in here when I ran the algorithm. But it turns out a majority of these reported tops didn't play him. Of course, since we are picking up from the Japanese meta, it could be a different story. At the same time, who knows what's going to happen in the next couple weeks in Asia? Law could see a crippling restriction or maybe even a ban at this point. Who knows? If we don't assume any changes, Ace could be very useful going into a meta with this much Law emphasis on the bat. So I've also isolated all of the lists that played Ace to put another build together. Of course, Ace does not have Rush when he's played in Law, but if we're playing the Mirror and our opponent has 1 active character and 1 restive character, we can play Ace, reduce both of them, tuck the active, and then hit the rested character with our other bodies. That way he manages to deplete our opponent's board and potentially their hand resources, and then 7k is one of those really awkward stat lines for the Mirror to get around. Knowing how to navigate your opening hand, manage your Dawn, swing at the right time to preserve your board and not just have everything KO'd as soon as they are rested, and then shift between aggression and defense are always crucial. But in a deck with a target on its back, no targeted search, and a variety of approaches to each matchup, he is one of the highest ceiling decks. Any matchup can be favorable, any matchup can crash and burn. It's all going to depend on the player using the deck. But I'll hop off my soapbox, get into these card count stats. 4 Shachi Penguin, all day, every day. Everybody is on Bone Clay, Kid Killer, and our reducers in some capacity. Kid and the Fin Smokes are almost uniform. Queen, Ein, Shuraya, Otama, and the Blocker Law are all above 70%. And then Choppers where things start to get a little more subjective. Lots and lots and lots and lots of tech options here. We've already discussed Ace. The 3-cost Rush Zoro is wonderful, but without Sakazuki, he's not as necessary. Kid Killer might be all the rush that we need. Zorojuro is a ramp machine. Just kind of hurts that you have to wait a turn for him. That did not stop people from playing him, though. Some lists featuring Zorojuro saw some very, very high achievements. I feel similarly about Beppo. Lots of potential to generate resources. The on-play is just a little conditional, and then the when attacking is subject to the same disadvantages that Zorojuro has. Some people played the 7-cost Ein from set 7. Conceptually, a very strong tempo play if we are running low on our reducers. I do think there is a big difference between 6k power and 7k power in a format where Law is the best deck, though. Promo Reducer Law, great card, in my opinion. I think he just got bumped out by some other slots we have. I could see a copy of Radbeamer 2 depending on your own playstyle preferences, depending on what matchups you're running into in your own meta. It's not something I'm putting in my first draft of the build, but I think there is potential there. Miss All Sunday is in line with the priorities I mentioned earlier on, and if I'm being honest, like, come on, the cowboy hat, come on. But if I'm adding more 5-cost characters, I'd rather max out Queen before I put her in. She doesn't have counter, she's not a blocker, she doesn't have as much flexible use beyond her on-play effect. I think set 7 Chopper's on-play effect is wonderful for this deck in particular. Just now we're seeing a bunch of mirrors. He's going to be on the bottom of the deck immediately. 2-cost Sanji was the bane of my existence anytime I ran into this matchup as Enel. So if you are in an Enel heavy meta, slot a couple of him in. Wonderful. Otherwise, he might not be as necessary. Kamazo does swing for 5. I guess if you're seeing a lot of Zoro in your meta, or if Black Yellow Luffy is for some reason routinely leaving their 2-cost kids out, I don't know. I'm trying to justify him as best as I can, so I'm not so negative on these pages. Actually, if black decks are not as worried about Law and they're going hardcore into those Rebecca plays, Fire Fist is still a great option for that. Also is perfect math to reduce an ace, so there's the case for that card. I'll say that Outlook the Third is pretty novel. Sort of like a mini ace against decks that run a lot of 5Ks, so the Mirror and Moria, if that's relevant for you. If you do want to go for a more Heart Pirates build, then the 3-cost Law can search those out. A lot of lists have cut Beppo, though, so he's only so consistent. And then I'd say that Morley and Brook are both pretty cheeky mirror techs to either get around blockers or to soften up multiple characters. Maybe I'll have some fun try them out. We'll see. For the cuts and additions, Chopper is very much a flex spot in this deck, as well as the 4-cost Law. You can also shave down the Shiraya, the Otama, or the Sanji, depending on how you're feeling. And for our additions, we can max out Queen, add more Otama, more 4-cost Law, bring Ace into the picture, Zorojuro, Rush Zoro, or the Miss All Sunday. Those are the first 10 additions that I had from the data, but I will not pretend that this deck is set in stone. And there's my guy, Trafalgar Law, number 1 in the countdown to OP07. As I alluded to in the Enel video, he is one of my main picks for this format. It just depends on how further testing goes. The concept makes sense, but this is not an easy deck. I personally only have so much time to get the reps in, so I might go with the comfort pick. If I get time. I feel like I'm always saying if I get time, but if I get time, he might make an appearance. With those individual profiles said and done, here is the final tier list. Law in tier 0, Lucci and Luffy tier 1, Enel and Bonney tier 2, Moria and Perona in tier 3, and then the rest in Rogue and Ha. When the ban first hit, Bonney and Luffy came out the gate hot, Bonney especially. But in that time, those Law players started getting more and more numerous. They started getting better and better. They started doing a lot. Law was getting a little crazy there. But then Lucci decided to calm him down. Luffy was also in the mix, playing his game. And then Law just decided to creep back up and up and up and up and up and up and up. And then it was a little crazy there. Not as bad as it could be and would be. But the end of this format, the end of set 7, that last little chunk was really one of those neat, highly competitive, very diverse sections that is really what I loved so much and found so interesting about the pre-ban format. As far as what ours is going to look like, it's really a toss-up. As I alluded to in the law section, right now the deck is in such an oppressive state in Japan that Bandai might do something about it. As far as if that happens, I can't say with any absolute certainty as to when. If we look to the Sakazuki ban, then we wouldn't see that until our own version of Set 8, and that is honestly what I would hope for, and would expect if the ban comes from the Asian side. If, however, law exceeds expectations even further over here, we could maybe get a Set 4 style ban the way they did Newgate. That's a bit outside of my realm of expectations, though. It's just something that occurred to me. But with that much uncertainty, that's also going to affect how many people decide to put the time and money into Law. He is at least twice as expensive as most other decks right now. So at this point, it just comes down to picking a proven deck that you feel comfortable with. I personally like looking at my own matchup rates as a way to figure out what deck I'm going to play. I do have some data for that. Only caveat is that it is not from a fully free and public source like the limitless data I have gone through in previous media. OP Bounty tracks every single game played on their platform in each format. Since the specifics of that information, how well one deck has done against another deck, is behind a very cheap paywall. If you have $5 to spare, highly recommend you shell it out for them. They're doing wonderful work. I do not feel ethically comfortable posting those individual matchup rates, but I have used those rates along with the achievement shares in each of these deck profiles to get expected win rates for each deck. I do also have this OPB wins column that is based on the proportion of total games played for each leader. So of the two measures, I'd say that's the less reliable one since it translates less accurately to the number of players in a tournament. These achievement shares also aren't one-to-one. I think they might be a little closer though. And stupendously, Moria is on top. I will say that the number of games Moria has played on OPB is noticeably lower than the rest of these decks at the top, so I think that is going to skew this data very, very highly. Going to show, as I mentioned in the Moria section, that it's one of those decks you can do well with if you really, really, really know it, but I wouldn't expect to pick it up and be playing like Newgate or Sakazuki. The decks shown here all were above 1% of games played on OPB at some point in June. I have covered the online limitless tourneys in previous videos, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing more of those. I did take a look at those. They've only had 2 with public leader info so far, so that's not really something that I figured was worth anyone's time to comment on in here. I'd love to do some reporting on those, on how matchup rates show up in actual tournament settings, as well as any dark horses that pop up as this format develops on our side of the world. But you know the spiel by now. There's a lot of factors at play there with scheduling and all that. But to finish things off, here is that pie chart of these leaders' achievement shares. I'm so excited for OP07. I'm between Enel and Law right now, but every deck is just so fun. If you couldn't tell from me saying that in every single section, this is such a fun format, and I can't wait to get back to locals again. I can't wait to be playing with my friends more, because I haven't done that much in a little while. This is such a great game. I love making content for it. I'm so tired right now. I'm gonna sleep for like a day and a half straight, but it was worth it because there's so much to talk about. There's so much to explore. I can't wait to see what new innovations people make in Set 7. If this has helped you at all, if you have your own ideas, please let me know. If you've enjoyed this, please like the video. And if you want to know when I get this going for Set 8, then as always, every single person who subscribes to this channel is very dear to me, and I am so thankful to everyone who is just down to listen to me spout on about this wacky data. But that's OP07. This is Soccer Kingdom. I should nap, but I think I might revisit that script I started writing about a group of homies playing card games. If there's something I really want to share with people, it is that. Oh, that's something we'll get into that at a later date. Thank you all so much. Enjoy set 7, and I'll see you soon.